Do these new ChiaoGoo Quad needles really help against knitting pain? Or are they just another expensive gimmick? Well, I splurged a little bit and bought the full range of these new cubic knitting needles so you don't have to. Let's see if they are worth the price or not. Here is the lowdown. So, as of now, ChiaoGoo actually does not offer these quads as a set. So, I had to buy each size separately, starting from size 3.25 millimeters all the way up to 8 millimeters, including a spare pouch. So this set, quote unquote, set me back by 237 euros, or around about $280. Am I the only one who thinks that price is kind of insane? Especially as this is without any accessories or any cables. It's just the needle tips. So let that price settle in for a second while I head over to my studio so we can take a very close look at these needles and whether they are worth it or not. So let's take a very close look at all of these beautiful new tips. As I've just said, ChiaoGoo currently does not sell the quads as a set, so you need to buy the tips separately. They come in these little plastic pouches, just like so. That's a lot of pouches. And then you can get one of their needle cases, and this is basically what I did here, so do not be confused. Currently they don't offer full sets, so I'm just going to take a very close look at the tips here. So as you can see, and as the name implies here, these needles are square. So the taper in here, the piece or the end piece here, is more or less the same when you compare them to the regular ChiaoGoo knitting needles, but here the middle, the body of those knitting needles is entirely square. And as you can see, the needle size is engraved here on one of the sides. So just so you can appreciate the difference, so these here would be the normal ChiaoGoo sharp knitting needles here. These are the new quads, and as you can see, the tips have the exact same length. The taper is, well, by all appearance, exactly the same. The end bit is exactly the same. So everything is exactly the same except here. This is square and this is round. It's also, well, by all appearance, the exact same material. This is stainless steel. ChiaoGoo says it's surgical grade stainless steel. So if you are familiar with these knitting needles, this will come as no big surprise. They also weigh the exact same. So here those are the quads, that's 13 gram, and here we have the old ones, that's 12. So it's more or less the same. So what is this square surface good for? Well, if you take a look, for example, at my thumb, then you might notice that this here is more or less a flat surface. Well, it has a slight curvature. So if I press a knitting needle here against it, then right now there's just a single, I don't know how well you will be able to see this, there's just a single point of contact, and I really need to press the knitting needle into my thumb. Whereas with a flat surface, as these square needles have 4 of them, the point of contact is much bigger. It's perhaps a little bit easier to see here with a little drawing. So let's suppose these are my little thumbs, and on this side I have a round knitting needle, and on this side I have a square knitting needle. You can instantly see that here you only initially, before you press your thumb really into the knitting needle, initially there's just a single point of contact, whereas here you just have so much more surface that can carry the weight of each of those stitches of your force, and it will distribute it a little bit more evenly here across the whole surface, and this can potentially be a little bit easier on your hands. Now the surface of these knitting needles is polished, but it's not mirror smooth, so they have, well, a little bit of a texture. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but if I compare these two coated metal needles, here on the right you can clearly see the difference. So those will not be super fast. They are very fast, but not, compared to coated metal needles, you will still notice a difference. Now, what can I tell you about these tips? As you can see, the ChiaoGoo Quads have a super long taper with a super sharp tip. By comparison, here on the left, those are the standard ChiaoGoo sharps, and the taper is just as long and the tips just as pointy. By comparison, these here on the right, those are the Knit Pro Cubics, and you can clearly see, apart from those being coated, you can clearly see that here this taper is quite a bit shorter, well, almost half a centimeter, and here the tip is quite a bit blunter. And if you compare, Knit Pro also has the cubics in a wooden quality, the Symphony, and here you can see that the taper is yet a little bit shorter. And by comparison, here those are the Adi Nouvelle. Let's get these cubics out of the way. Here the Adi Nouvelle knitting needles, also square, but with this little meandering, these bumps here. But anyway, the tips of these Adi needles is, I would say, well, exactly the same. Well, the taper is even, well, I would say even, well, a millimeter or two longer, and those are the is the comparison to all the other big players on the market for ergonomic knitting needles. So if you are not familiar with the ChiaoGoo tips yet, so here these tips are super sharp. And if you are someone who pushes the tips a lot with your fingertips, then this is definitely something you will notice over time. And in this case, maybe, so these are the Knit Pro tips. Those are quite a bit blunter and might be the better option for someone who doesn't need these super sharp tips and pushes the fingertips a lot against those tips. Now let's take a look at the other end of these knitting needles. Here you have the familiar high quality ChiaoGoo join. The only difference is here the transition, of course, towards the cable is also initially square, but other than that, here this is super smooth. So let's try to take a look at it from a different angle. Can you see how smooth and well manufactured this is here? If I glide across this here with my fingernail, I barely, well, maybe a hunch of a hunch. This is all I get from this join, and here this end piece is also very nice. So just test this here with a piece of yarn. Can you see how effortless things glide across? Also here at an angle, if I place this like so, Nothing really catches it. There's a slight step, of course, but other than this, a super smooth and seamless transition. Now let's test the same here with a bit of knitting. Can you see how well these stitches glide across this joint? This is what I want to see when we are talking about the perfect knitting needles. And see, even if you are a lace knitter, see how effortless this gossamer yarn glides across this transition. So here there is nothing. Here maybe a tiny little bit of a step, but still I would say this will be still a very pleasant knitting experience. So far I have been full of praise for these new ChiaoGoo Quads, but what about the knitting qualities? Are they actually easier and more comfortable in your hands? Do they alleviate any sort of knitting pain? Well, I knitted a couple of these scrappy dishcloths to test things, and I have to say, when it comes to the knitting qualities, my verdict is possibly a lot more mixed. Let's take a look why that is the case. First of all, most fans of ChiaoGoo will be tempted to combine these knitting needles with their beloved red twist cables. And you know, these are lovely because they never curl, they always stay put. But since this is coated wire, they are also very rigid. So what does this mean? So here, I'm not forcing these knitting needles in any position. This is how these knitting needles will naturally settle into this position. So if I flex my knitting needles in this direction, watch what happens. It automatically snaps back. And this means if you hold your knitting needles like so, they will always be in this exact position, and you can't actually bring them in a different position, which means as you grip them, I don't know how, so in this case, as I grip them here, these are relaxed. As I grip them, my thumbs are, without forcing them in any other direction, my thumb here is actually pressing against the corner, but of course it actually needs to press against the flat surface. And especially if you're using such a short cable, I feel this effect is so extreme to the point that they become unusable, because I constantly press against these sharp corners here, and every time I try to twist them around, there's so much tension on the cable that they instantly snap back again. So this is a big no for me. Now, of course, ChiaoGoo seems to have been aware of this big issue, and that's why they released swivel adapters. So these are here little connector pieces, and you can screw them to your existing cables. And now it's a little bit tricky so you need to, because this is obviously rotating around a lot, you need 2 keys here to screw things tight, and then you can attach this bit as well. But now you turn your regular red twist cables into swivel cables, and suddenly you have no issue here with the position of these corners, of these edges, and only with these swivel cables can I actually use these quads. You could, of course, also use the new, or well, not so new anymore, the ChiaoGoo swivel, I think they're called 360 swivel cables or so. But actually, I don't recommend them, because those are the worst cables I have ever seen. Here, can you see how horribly this catches the yarn, they are also a lot more flexible. It's just horrible. It snags, whereas here this would be the ChiaoGoo Quads with the swivel connector, and here you have no such issue at all. The transition is super seamless. So if you want, and that is my recommendation, if you want to use those quads, definitely invest in one of these swivel adapters. They will make the experience so much better. So with my swivel adapters equipped, let's knit a couple of stitches together. So as I knit this little scrappy dishcloth here, I can really tell you, it's always difficult to capture this on camera, but these tapers, these slender long tapers with these sharp tips, those make things a true joy to knit. And you would think that, I don't know, this little square transition here kinda might obstruct your knitting flow or so, but none of that. This is a very, very smooth experience for stockinette stitch, but also more complicated stitches. So this is a true joy. They are also, well, they're not super fast, obviously, because this isn't coded, but they are very, well, very quick, while still offering a little bit of a resistance. And I guess for those knitters that experience pain while knitting for multiple reasons, you guys probably are not interested in, you know, rocket speed. You just want to knit at a measured pace comfortably without pain. And for those, this, well, stainless steel surface should totally suffice. Now, of course, there is more to this, and here is where I really have another issue. So even if you connect the swivel adapter, so I'm using these 8mm knitting needles, so I hope I can show this to you a little bit better. So this is how I normally hold my knitting needles, and you can clearly see how well my thumb is here connected with this flat surface. But let's take a look at my other fingers, mainly my index finger, and then here my ring finger. And if we take a look at my index finger isn't actually connected to the flat surface, but rather this corner here. And the same goes for especially my ring finger. Let's remove my ring finger is also kind of pressing here against this corner. This means my thumb benefits from this flat surface, and this is quite nice because it prevents me from, you know, hyper flexing this thumb too much, which of course takes away a strain. However, here the corners are definitely pressing of these quads are definitely pressing here, in my case, into this, well, little joint here. And I need to be very honest with you here. I personally find these sharp corners almost uncomfortable, to the point that they cause rather than alleviate pain. So I don't know how well you will be able to see this, but here, this is almost the perfect square, and these corners aren't rounded at all. Now, I don't know how well you will be able to see this, but here, those are the ChiaoGoo Quads, and those are the Knit Pro Cubics. And maybe it's because they are coded, I don't know. But when I grip the ChiaoGoo Quads, it's all edges and angles, whereas these coded metal needles, they feel so much nicer and so much more comfortable in my hand, whereas this is just edges. It almost hurts me, I have to say. Now, please bear in mind, this is of course criticizing on a very high level. You definitely should realize that typically stitches are wrapped around your knitting needles anyway, so you are very rarely directly in contact, or just at the beginning or the end of a row, you are very rarely directly in contact with your knitting needles. There's always the yarn, the stitches here wrapped around your knitting needles that sort of act as a buffer. But still, I will say, and I will hold, that here gripping these knitting needles, for me it's almost uncomfortable. Now, I have one major issue with these knitting needles. So these are supposed to be the 8mm knitting needles, and if I measure them, one side is 6.9mm wide. This means the whole circumference that defines the size of your stitches is round about 28 millimeters. However, if you do the math and pick a round knitting needle size 8 millimeters, then the circumference will be 25 millimeters. So by comparison, those here are the Knit Pro cubics, also size 8 millimeters, and here you can see 6.55 millimeters. Then if you multiply this times 4, you are a lot closer to the circumference of a standard round knitting needle of the same size. So I did a little test. I knitted 3 swatches, one with the 5mm quads, one with the 5mm normal ChiaoGoo needles, and then one with the 5mm Knit Pro cubics. All 10 stitches wide and 10 rows high. And then I basically tried to stretch them as far as I possibly could. And unsurprisingly, the swatch with the ChiaoGoo Quads had the widest gauge. Personally, I don't know what's up with these needle sizes and why ChiaoGoo picked this system. For me, it doesn't make any sense, but maybe someone among you can explain it. Please comment below. Anyway, what is my final verdict? So, first of all, these lusciously long, slender tapers with these super sharp tips, they are just everything, at least for me personally. They just glide through the stitches like butter. The join towards the cable is just perfection, even if you add these new swivel adapters. And the fact that you can use these tips with the red twist cables is possibly the icing on the cake for a lot of fans of these cables. The needles themselves are very well manufactured, and I find it hard to find a flaw with the needles themselves, apart from the aforementioned issue with the sizing. At the same time, I do not exactly feel this is a successful product. Without buying these new swivel adapters or new swivel cables, I don't actually think the product makes any sense at all, and it doesn't work because, especially when you use such short cables, these rigid wire cables force the tips into a certain position, and that might mean you are actually in contact with the edges and not the flat surfaces that are supposed to alleviate the knitting pain and make things more comfortable. On top of that, I do feel that the corners of these needles are a little bit too sharp. This will of course depend a little bit on how you hold your knitting needles, how you tension your yarn, how tightly you grip, or how loose a knitter you are. But for me personally, I always felt that these edges pushed a little bit too deeply into the other side of my hands, or not my thumb, but the other fingers. And I feel that the other brands on the market for ergonomic knitting needles handle that part a little bit better and offer needles with edges that are a little bit more rounded. Personally, I actually feel that the standard ChiaoGoo knitting needles rest better in my hands. But then again, I luckily don't have arthritis or suffer from tendonitis. it also has to be mentioned that there's not just one cause for knitting pain, and that there's not just one way to hold a knitting needle. And I sincerely believe it's just awesome that these days we have all these options, especially since these tips are available down to size of 3.25 millimeters, and neither Knit Pro nor Adi offer needles, at least not ergonomic knitting needles, in that size range. So I mean, that's just great. I do wish that these ChiaoGoo Quads would also come with blunt tips. Now make no mistakes, I love sharp tips, but I am also aware that for a lot of knitters, these stiletto sharp tips are actually a cause of pain. I feel it would make so much sense, especially in the context of knitting pain and ergonomic knitting, to offer sharp and blunt tips and not just 4-inch or 5-inch tips. Overall, I just can't recommend these needles. To me, it almost feels like they saw how Adi did ergonomic knitting needles, and I don't know when it was, 2020. Then Knit Pro and Prim followed up. They seem to be successful, so we need to copy them. And then they released some random Me Too product without actually adding any innovation. I mean, I can see how fans of ChiaoGoo who already own accessories, who already own the cables and a pouch, for them it possibly makes a bit more sense financially speaking. But other than that, you need to realize that the Knit Pro Cubic sets is probably 5 times less expensive than these needles currently are, and I actually feel they are a little bit better on top of that. I mean, on the other hand, $22 that's a relatively small price to pay for the potential of longer knitting session and or less pain. So if you already own some ChiaoGoo knitting needles, give them a shot. Maybe they work for you, and if they don't, well, yeah, it's not a big price to pay. Anyway, let me know what you think. Maybe you have some experience with these needles or other cubic knitting needles, then please comment below. I'd be interested in your thoughts and experiences. As always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.